When Barron Trump stepped into a high-end restaurant in Los Angeles, he had no idea his red MAGA cap would ignite a public outcry. What followed was not merely beyond the restaurant manager's expectations, it echoed all over the city. A day that began like any ordinary day. It was a sunny afternoon in Los Angeles, the sort of afternoon that begged to be lingered over and savored. Barron Trump, now a teenager, had passed his morning alone, reading and content. Needing a meal, he walked over to La Terrace, an upscale eatery so exclusive that celebrities, tycoons, and socialites sat there in discreet elegance. He had been there previously. He used to like the peaceful environment of the restaurant, where the service was excellent and the atmosphere of conversations was quiet. Today would be an exception, the hat that changed everything. When Barron strode through the glass doors, he stood out at once, not just for his vast size, but also because of the unmistakable red "Make America Great Again" hat on his head. He wore it like it was his own, not as a statement, not as a challenge, but just because he was so. The hostess, a woman in her mid-30s with a poised and professional demeanor, greeted him warmly and led him to a quiet corner table. The restaurant wasn't particularly crowded. Patrons sipped their wine, engaged in low conversation, seemingly lost in their own worlds. But then the whispers began, the shift in the room. At first, Barron did not notice. He was focused on the menu, reading silently for his order of choice. But from across the room, murmurs of whispers started going around. A man nudged his friend, waitstaff whispered to each other by the bar, and furtive but unmistakable glances flashed his way. Then from the back of the restaurant, the manager appeared, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit with an even sharper attitude. He approached Barron's table, his expression set. The confrontation. "Excuse me," the manager said, loudly enough to catch other diners' attention. "We have a policy against political attire. I'm going to have to ask you to remove the hat." Barron lifted his head, surprised but composed. He slowly removed his earbuds and set them on the table. "I had no idea there was such a policy," he said, tone even and unwavering. The manager crossed his arms, gesturing in a vague direction toward the door. "It's outlined in our code of conduct. We prefer to keep this as a neutral area for all patrons." For an instant, Barron simply stared at him. Some customers in the vicinity were pretending not to hear, while others watched the exchange with rapt attention. "I don't want to cause any trouble," Barron answered, his voice steady. "I just stopped in for lunch." But the manager stood firm. "You will have to take off the hat, or else you will have to leave." The decision that left everyone speechless. There was a silence at the restaurant. Barron glanced about, conscious of the eyes upon him, of the tension. And then, with a silent nod of his head, he leaned back in his chair and stood up. "If that is how you feel," he said quietly, "then I'll go." The entire room seemed to wait, holding its breath. Without a word, he gathered his belongings, leaving an untouched glass of water sitting on the counter behind him. As he approached the door, the soft sound of the door closing behind him announced more than his departure. It left behind an impenetrable, lasting unease. The fallout. What occurred within the walls of La Terrace that afternoon didn't remain within them. It spread quickly throughout the city, fueling arguments, front pages, and thousands of reactions. Was this an example of upholding neutrality or silencing personal expression? One thing was certain. The conversation was far from over. The aftermath begins. Beyond the restaurant, the air was thick as smoke, the California sun casting long shadows on the pavement. Barron Trump paused, feeling the warm air brush against his face. He took a deep breath, pushing his red MAGA hat further back, less in defiance than as a polite reaffirmation of his right to do so. He wasn't angry, annoyed maybe, but most of all, he was disappointed. He had been taught as a child to treat people with respect, to disagree with dignity, and here he was, being asked to leave because he wore a hat expressing his faith. This wasn't about restaurant policy, it was a breach of those same principles. Inside, the tension lingered. The murmurs in La Terrace had only grown louder. A waiter bent over the manager. "Do you think that was a good idea?" The manager didn't even look up. "That's him," the waiter whispered. The manager waved him away with his hand. We can't make exceptions. If we let him remain, it sets the wrong precedent. This is my restaurant and I'll do as I want. But even as he uttered the words, he had the feeling of sickness in his belly. A different perspective, Barron, on the other hand, walked a few blocks to a little park. He sat down on an unoccupied bench and retrieved his phone. He first sent a text message to his mum to inform her of what happened. Then he sent texts to a few close friends, not to seek sympathy but to get things figured out. Had he overreacted? Was the manager justified? The answers came virtually at once. That's ridiculous. They shouldn't have done that to you. You handled it a lot better than I would have. As he read through the messages, a plan started to form in his mind. This wasn't an act of revenge. He didn't want to worsen matters or turn it into a spectacle. Instead, he saw something in it, an opportunity, something useful, something meaningful. If the restaurant did not wish to make political statements, then why not nudge the discussion towards harmony and understanding instead? A plan in motion. Barron rose to his feet, a fire of determination in his eyes. He dialed the first number. "Hey, I need your help with something," he said. It was just the beginning of a series of calls that would soon set his plan into action. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, the atmosphere inside La Terrasse had grown tense. News of the incident had already begun to spread, and social media was on fire. Customers who had seen the commotion started sharing their versions on social media. "They threw Barron Trump out for wearing a hat," one of the posts read, complete with a blurry photo of the scene. "Freedom of expression? Guess not at LA Terrace," another wrote. Behind the bar, the manager scrolled through his phone. His fingers remained hovering over the screen as he read the tide of comments coming in. A knot formed in his stomach. Not all of the reactions were good. "Let them talk," he grumbled to himself, trying to push away the growing sense of unease. But deep down, he knew the situation was slipping out of control. The story goes viral. By the time Barron returned home, the news was already abuzz. Some of the local influencers had picked up on the story, their captions ranging from supportive to strongly polarized. Barron scrolled through the posts, but did not spend much time on them. He did not want to fuel drama or make the chasm any wider. His focus was elsewhere. For whereas the web bickered and debated what had transpired, Barron Trump was busy strategizing what lay ahead. Turning controversy into a movement, Barron Trump sat at his desk that evening, a small leather-bound book in front of him. He flipped through its pages, jotting down notes as the day's events replayed in his mind. It wasn't just the manager's reaction that stuck with him. It was the silent glares, the mumbled words, the people who had watched and said nothing. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wanted better, something that would shift the conversation from battle to dialogue. And then, out of nowhere, it struck him. A fundraiser. Not just any fundraiser, but an event designed to unite people, a statement that it is possible to live in unity, even in communities of disunity. His purpose? To assist struggling communities and create open forums of discourse and understanding. The plan takes shape. Without hesitation, Barron grabbed his phone and called. "Hello, this is Barron Trump. I need some help with organizing a charity event. Yes, it's on a tight timeline. Can we talk tomorrow?" The person on the other end of the line sounded surprised, but quickly agreed. As the evening progressed, his scheme became more specific. He outlined his plan in the notebook, considering logistics, goals, and impact. And then he boldly decided the event would take place outside LA Terrace. He was not choosing the location for display. He had to prove something. Unity could flourish even on grounds of war. By midnight, first calls had been placed. A good friend had volunteered to help with coordination, and the wheels were in motion. Inside LA Terrace. The restaurant was different that night. The manager, now convinced he had done the right thing, now paced to and fro. The situation had long since spiraled out of control, past the doors of the restaurant. News had caught wind of it. Twitter was aflame, and the argument raged on. There were a few who supported the manager's right to enforce the policy. Others assaulted him, calling the restaurant hypocrites. "So much for an objective space," wrote one. "To kick someone out isn't objective. It's taking a side. Normal customers started phoning in cancellations. The restaurant, once bustling with people, now looked curiously empty. Workers exchanged worried looks with each other, wondering what the consequences would be for them. The manager assured himself it would blow over, but in his heart, he wasn't so sure. The morning after, a new chapter. When the sun rose the next day, something remarkable was happening out front of LA Terrace. An empty city block was coming to life. Trucks pulled up, unloading tables, signs and audio gear. Volunteers hurried around, setting up chairs and organizing donation stalls. A small stage was constructed in the center of it all, and leading it all, commanding every aspect, was Barron Trump. This wasn't just about responding to what had happened. It was all about demonstrating that even in disunity, there is a forward path, creating peace from conflict. Barron Trump stood at the center of the compromise, watching as the finishing touches were put on. A large banner unfolded on top of the stage, its words bold and graphic. "United we stand, building bridges, not walls." This was not just a fundraiser, it was a statement, a movement. Barron spent the night making calls to organizations that are experts in community outreach, youth mentoring, and open dialogue. This was not about raising money, it was about building a space where all people from all walks of life could come together. Food vendors filled the sidewalk, the smell of fresh street food wafting through the air. Live music echoed throughout the crowd, giving an inspirational feel. Charities from around the area had tables set up, giving guests conversations that counted. The same place that was the cause of conflict the day before was now alive with unity and connection. A gathering unlike any other. By noon, it was packed. There were families, young working professionals, activists, and even popular social media personalities. They weren't there to witness something occurring. They were there to witness it. Barron was up on the stage, the microphone in hand. The chatter died as the whole room faced him. He had a strong voice, yet there was sincerity in his voice. A sincerity that was commanding to hear. "Yesterday I was told to leave a restaurant because of a hat, and that's okay. I get their policy, even if I don't agree with it. But what actually stung wasn't getting turned away. It was the background." The audience listened intently. "We've become so quick to judge each other, to take a side, to close down a conversation before it ever begins. But that's not us. We can do better." A wave of applause swept the crowd. Barron hesitated, then continued, "This is not about them, and this is not about me. This is about all of us, listening, getting it, uniting. The funds we raise today will help fund programs fostering dialogue and unity. Thank you for being here, and thank you for showing that unity is always greater than division." The clapping was louder this time. As Barron departed the stage, people approached him, shaking hands, giving words of encouragement, thanking him for standing up in a way that built bridges instead of walls. A different scene. Inside LA Terrace. Meanwhile, just feet away, the atmosphere inside LA Terrace could not have been more different. The manager stood against the window, arms crossed, watching the chaos outside. He had expected protest, he had expected criticism, but he had not expected this. His employees had witnessed it too. A few had stolen quietly out into the night, drawn by music, by laughter, and perhaps by a glimmer of something more than business. A server who had viewed the fight on the previous day returned inside and whispered, "Go out there, talk to him." The manager bristled. "This is not my fight." The waiter shrugged. "Maybe not. But it might be your chance." For an instant, the manager didn't move. He simply served himself a glass of water, surveying the rising crowd. He didn't want to push the idea aside, to stick with his decision, but something in the vision outside prohibited that. A movement, bigger than one moment. By the afternoon, Barron's fundraiser was the talk of the town. Social media was abuzz with photos, live streams and hashtags like "Number Building Bridges" and "Number United We Stand." No one was merely talking about what happened yesterday. They were talking about what was happening now. And for the first time since the incident, the manager of LA Terrace began wondering, had he made the wrong choice? A turning point. The event had already drawn people, but now it was drawing even more. News teams were present, cameras in hand, capturing the vibe, the togetherness, and Barron's powerful message. A few feet away, inside LA Terrace, the contrast could not have been more vivid. The popular restaurant was nearly empty. Tables that had been reserved weeks in advance remained empty. The handful of patrons who were still there weren't paying attention to their food. They kept looking outside, as though they knew something was happening out there. The manager attempted to tune it out, concentrating on his work, but his staff's tension couldn't be dismissed. A waitress hesitated before coming over. Customers have been asking about the event. They say it is amazing looking. Some actually said that we should go there. The jaw of the manager clenched. He said nothing. Instead, he moved aside, going into his office and closing the door. He leaned forward in his chair and stared at his screen. His inbox was full, grumblings of angry customers, cancellation notices, and grumblings of local media. But there was an email that was different. It was from a regular customer. "I've always loved LA Terrace. Yesterday's experience was highly disappointing. Requesting that someone be removed for their own opinions isn't neutrality, it's polarization. I hope you'll find a way to rectify this." The words hit harder than he had expected. Was it really about keeping the restaurant neutral? Or had he let his own opinion sway his decision? He leaned back in his chair, running his hand through his hair, the noise of the event outside filtering through the walls. The moment everything changed, outside, the fundraiser was a go. A local jazz band filled the air with lively music. Children laughed, coloring murals at an art station. Donation boxes overflowed, and in the middle of it all was Barron, as a name on marquee, as a newspaper headline, number as a leader. He navigated his way through the crowd with ease, shaking hands, listening to people's stories, holding real conversations. His confidence was not flashy and self-righteous. It was real, the kind that only comes from knowing you're doing something that truly matters. Then, a sudden shift in the crowd's attention. A murmur rippled through the audience. People turned toward the restaurant doors. The manager had stepped outside. He hesitated on the steps, adjusting his tie. For the first time, he didn't look like the man who had confidently asked Barron to leave the day before. Slowly, he made his way toward Barron. The crowd parted. Conversations quieted. Barron saw him approaching. He didn't flinch. He didn't step back. Instead, he offered a small, polite smile. And then, he extended his hand. The manager froze for a second. Then, with a deep breath, he reached out and shook it. "I'd like to talk." His voice was quiet, almost drowned out by the hum of the event around them. Barron nodded. "Of course." He indicated to a less dense area near the edge of the event. The two men moved side by side as the crowd behind them made space, eyeing them intently. A conversation was on the verge of taking place, and it had the potential to alter everything. A moment of change. The manager glanced over the crowd behind them, then at Barron. "I have to start by saying I didn't do yesterday well." His voice was low, even, but there was the faintest sense of regret. "I thought I was doing what was best for my restaurant, for my staff, but now I realize that I was mistaken. I judged you, and I acted out of fear, not justice." Barron listened intently, his expression calm but urging. Then, after a pause, he said, "It takes a great deal of courage to admit when one is wrong. Thank you for doing so." The manager let out a sigh of relief, as though something had been taken off his shoulders. "Looking at what you've done today, it's embarrassing," he said. "You could have fought back, made this a public defamation against my company, but you didn't. You did something good, something that most people wouldn't do." Barron smiled faintly. "I don't think the world needs more anger or division." He swept his hand over the party they were standing amidst, the music, the conversations, the relationships being forged in the moment. Something that occurred last night may have just been another aside piece of noise, but I wanted to illustrate there's an alternative. The manager nodded deliberately, considering his words. "You did, and I'd like to be behind what you're doing here. If there's something that can be done for me or for the restaurant, I'd be open to it." Barron hesitated for a moment before responding. "The most valuable contribution is to consider the way we treat each other. Policies are essential, but never at the expense of compassion and kindness. LA Terrace could possibly have a function like this, something which brings people together instead of putting them apart. The manager blinked with astonishment at the suggestion, and then, his face folding into a small smile. "Let's do it. It's a good idea." And again, they shook hands, with warmth this time. The crowd, sensing that the issue had been resolved, began to applaud, but not politely and on routine. This was applauding from the heart, for real, as a genuine recognition of the event, a lasting message. And as the night went on its way, Barron came out on stage for the final time. "We all do make errors," he asserted, his voice solid and unyielding. "It's how we handle them that matters." He glanced out at the sea of people before him, people from all walks of life brought together. Today was not about raising money. It was about showing that even when we are opposed, we can find common ground. "Thank you for proving that unity is not only possible, but imperative." The crowd applauded. As night descended upon Los Angeles, Barron stayed with his friends and family, watching the last of the guests trickle out. But they weren't heading home with memories of the event alone. They were sharing its message. A final thought. This story is left with an important reminder. Battles, large or small, don't have to leave us bitter and torn asunder. By choosing grace, understanding, and active resolution, we can turn even the most difficult moments into moments of connection and growth.